December 23, 1940, Ortona, Italy. A Canadian sergeant from the Loyal Edmonton Regiment presses his back against a bullet-riddled wall. His uniform is caked in plaster dust and blood that isn't all his. Above him, German snipers control every street, every window, every cobblestone. 3 men from his platoon tried to cross the road 30 seconds ago. None made it. Standard tactics. Say call artillery. Level the block. Send infantry through the rubble. Accept the casualties. But this sergeant has a different idea. He looks at the wall behind him. Not a barrier, a doorway. He signals to his demo man. Blow it. What happens next will change urban warfare forever. It will save American lives in Fallujah 60 years later. And it starts with 4 pounds of explosives and a leap into darkness that no one saw coming. But before I tell you what he did, we need to understand something most Americans never learned. This wasn't just one man's innovation. This was a small army from across our northern border that fought some of World War II's dirtiest battles and paid a price that would have broken most nations. This is the story your history teacher never told you, the story of the Allies America forgot. My name is Tom Harrison. I'm 79 years old. I served in Korea, watched my father come home from the Pacific with stories that gave him nightmares until the day he died in 1987. He was a Marine, Iwo Jima. He came back with shrapnel in his leg and a Purple Heart he kept in a drawer because looking at it hurt too much. But there's one story he never told me, one I only learned decades later, digging through archives my own country barely keeps. The story of Canada's war. Now I know what you're thinking. Canada? The polite folks up north with the Mounties and the maple syrup, what did they do in World War II? Here's what your high school history class probably taught you. America entered the war after Pearl Harbor. We island hopped across the Pacific. We landed at Normandy. We beat Hitler and Tojo. The end. Here's what they didn't teach you. While we were still debating whether to enter the war, Canada was already bleeding in Italy. While we were building our army from 17 divisions to 61, Canada's 5 divisions were training to become something the Germans would learn to respect in the hardest way possible. This isn't mythology. This isn't Canadian propaganda. These are facts from American, British, and German archives that deserve to be remembered before the last of the greatest generation, Canadian and American both, take these stories to their graves. So let me take you back to a war we thought we knew everything about. Back to beaches and battles where a small nation punched so far above its weight that even our own generals had to step back and say, "Send in the Canadians." September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland. Britain and France declare war 2 days later. Canada didn't have to fight. They weren't attacked. They had no treaty obligation forcing their hand. Their parliament could have stayed neutral, sold supplies to Britain, and watched from across the Atlantic in safety. Instead, on September 10th, Canada declared war on Germany voluntarily, a nation of 11 million people taking on the Wehrmacht. Why? Because to that generation of Canadians, when Britain called, you answered. Their fathers had bled at Vimy Ridge in Nancy. 22 years later, their sons volunteered to do it again. But here's what made the Canadian Army different from ours when America finally joined in December 1941. We built our army fast. Pearl Harbor to D-Day was 30 months. In that time, we went from 500,000 men under arms to over 8 million. We built the divisions, trained the troops, shipped them overseas, and threw them into combat. Some units landed in Normandy with soldiers who'd been civilians 6 months earlier. Canada took a different path. They spent nearly 5 years preparing. From 1939 to 1944, Canadian troops trained in Britain. They didn't see major combat for years and they hated it. They wanted to fight. But their commanders, learning from World War I slaughter, insisted we train until we're ready. By June 6, 1944, the average Canadian infantryman wasn't a draftee with 12 weeks of basic training. He was a volunteer who drilled for years in the harshest conditions Britain could offer. He'd practiced amphibious assaults until he could do them in his sleep. He'd zeroed his rifle so many times he could tell you the serial number in the dark. When the invasion of Europe finally came, Canada fielded just 5 infantry divisions and 2 armored brigades. Compared to America's 61 divisions and Britain's 25, they were tiny. But what they lacked in size, they made up for in lethality. June 6, 1940, D-Day. You know this story. You've seen Saving Private Ryan. You've read the books. You know about Omaha Beach, where American boys died in the surf, where the sand turned red, where every yard cost blood. 20 miles east, another beach was being stormed. Its code name was Juno, 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, the Regina Rifles, the Royal Winnipeg Rifles, the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada, men with names like Jean-Paul Deschamps and William McRae, farmers from Saskatchewan, factory workers from Montreal, loggers from British Columbia. They hit the same Atlantic wall, same German defenders, same machine gun nests and concrete bunkers, same underwater obstacles designed to rip landing craft apart. The first wave landed at 7:35 a.m., 10 minutes late because of rough seas. Those 10 minutes cost them. The tide had risen. The beach obstacles were underwater and invisible. Landing craft struck mines and exploded. Men jumped into water over their heads, weighed down with 60 pounds of gear. Some drowned before they ever saw the enemy. Those who made it to shore faced the killing zone. German machine guns in fortified positions swept the beach in overlapping fields of fire. Mortar rounds dropped among the landing craft. Snipers picked off officers and NCOs. The casualty rate in the first hour was catastrophic. 50% in some companies. On one stretch of beach, the Queen's Own Rifles lost half their strength in the first 15 minutes. But here's what the history books often miss. By nightfall, the Canadians had pushed 7 miles inland, deeper than any other Allied force, American or British, deeper than Omaha, Utah, Gold, or Sword. How? Because when a Canadian unit hit a strong point, they didn't wait for orders. They improvised. Privates took command when lieutenants died. Sergeants led charges that should have been suicide. Engineers blew obstacles under fire so tanks could get through. By midnight, June 6th, while American forces were still consolidating their beachhead and British forces were bogged down by German armor, Canadian troops were in the outskirts of Caen, their D-Day objective. They didn't take Caen that day. German reinforcements would turn that battle into a month-long nightmare. But on that first day, the Canadians had done what many thought impossible: crack the Atlantic wall and keep going. Cost: 91 Canadian casualties on D-Day out of 21,400 who landed at Juno. A 4% casualty rate in 24 hours. But they were in, and they weren't stopping. Now, let me take you back 6 months. December 1940, before D-Day, before Normandy, before most Americans even knew where they'd be fighting in Europe. Italy. The soft underbelly of Europe, Churchill called it. soft like a cactus, the American GIs said. By December, the Allied advance up the Italian boot had stalled in mud and mountains. The U.S. Fifth Army was bleeding itself dry trying to break through at Monte Cassino. The British Eighth Army needed a breakthrough on the Adriatic coast. The objective was a medieval town called Ortona, population 10,000 before the war. Now defended by German paratroopers from the elite 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, the same ones who jumped into Crete and fought across Russia. The town itself was a fortress, narrow cobblestone streets barely wide enough for a jeep, stone buildings 3 and 4 stories tall with walls 2 feet thick. Rubble from Allied bombing blocked the roads, perfect sniper heaven. The Germans planned to bleed the Allies white, make them pay for every house, every room, every stairwell, turn Ortona into a meat grinder that would stall the entire Italian campaign. First, Canadian Infantry Division got the job, specifically the Loyal Edmonton Regiment and the C4th Highlanders of Canada. They attacked on December 20th. Immediately they learned what the Germans already knew. Standard tactics would get you killed. Step into a street, sniper bullet. Try to rush a building, machine gun nest in the window. Call artillery. Stone buildings absorb shells like sponges. Send tanks, rubble blocks them, and German anti-tank teams are waiting. For 2 days, Canadian casualties mounted. Company commanders watched their units get chewed apart. Platoons disappeared into buildings and never came out. The Germans owned the streets, the windows, the rooftops. They could see everything and shoot everything that moved. Let me tell you about our one man, Private Jack Simpson, 22 years old, worked in a lumber mill outside Vancouver before he enlisted in '90. He wrote letters home to his mother every week, told her about the training in England, about the guys in his squad who became his brothers. His last letter home was written December 19th, the night before Ortona. He told his mother not to worry. He told her the war would be over soon and he'd be home to help with the spring planting. He signed it, "Your loving son, Jack." December 21st, Jack's squad was ordered to clear a 3-story building on Via Cavour. They went in through the front door. German machine gun fire from the 2nd floor cut down the first 2 men instantly. Jack and 4 others made it to cover. Standard procedure said withdraw and call for artillery. But Jack looked at his squad leader, a sergeant from Edmonton named Thompson, and saw something in the man's eyes, a kind of cold fury. Thompson pointed at the ceiling, the attic. Then he pointed at the wall they were sheltering behind, the shared wall with the next building. They had one PIAT anti-tank weapon, basically a spring-loaded tube that fired a shaped charge. Thompson aimed it at the wall. Jack and the others pressed themselves flat. Thompson fired. The explosion was deafening in the enclosed space. Dust and smoke filled the room. Through the ringing in his ears, Jack heard Thompson shout, "Grenades!" Jack pulled the pin on his grenade and threw it blind through the hole in the wall. 2 more grenades followed. Then Thompson was moving, scrambling through the hole before the smoke cleared, submachine gun blazing. Jack followed. He didn't think about it. You don't think in moments like that. You just move. Through the hole, into chaos. A German soldier stumbled toward him through the smoke. Jack's rifle came up. He fired twice. The man went down. The room was small. Another German lunged at Thompson with a bayonet. Jack shot him too. His 3rd shot jammed. He dropped the rifle, pulled his knife, and found himself in close combat with a German paratrooper who was just as terrified and just as desperate as he was. Jack survived that room. He survived the next wall they blew through. He survived 8 days of the most brutal close-quarters combat of the entire war. He made it home to Vancouver in 1940. He never talked about Ortona, never told his mother what really happened in those buildings. He worked at the lumber mill for 42 years, raised 3 kids, and died in '98 at age 77. His grandson only learned about his grandfather's war when he found the medals in a shoebox after the funeral. Victoria Cross recommendation, denied because there weren't enough witnesses left alive to corroborate the action. Jack never knew he'd been recommended. Never knew that the technique he and Thompson and thousands of others used in those desperate rooms became standard NATO doctrine. That technique, mouse-holing, became the way modern armies fight in cities. For 8 days and nights, this brutal room-to-room fighting consumed Ortona. German paratroopers, hardened veterans who'd fought across Europe, later said they'd never experienced anything like it. They were trained to defend streets and intersections. They weren't prepared for enemies who came through the walls like ghosts. The Canadians didn't just fight building to building. They adapted constantly. When the Germans started ambushing them in attics, Canadians started mouse-holing through ground floors instead. When the Germans rigged buildings with explosives, Canadians learned to spot the wires and cut them. When the Germans tried to retreat across the town square at night, Canadian snipers were waiting. Journalists called it Little Stalingrad. The comparison wasn't wrong. This was total war in miniature. No front lines, no rear areas. Just 2 armies trying to kill each other in the closest, most brutal conditions imaginable. By December 28th, Ortona was in Canadian hands. The elite German paratroopers had withdrawn, leaving their dead behind. The cost was horrific. 132 Canadian casualties out of roughly 6,000 engaged. A 23% casualty rate in 8 days. But here's why this matters to you watching this decades later. Mouse-holing became standard doctrine. Every Western military studied Ortona. British SAS learned it. American Rangers learned it. And 60 years later, when U.S. Marines fought house to house in Fallujah, Iraq, they used the same technique Canadian farm boys and lumber mill workers had invented in an Italian town most Americans can't find on a map. Jack Simpson's war, Thompson's innovation, the sacrifice of 1,000 Canadians is still saving American lives today. Now, I need to tell you something lighter, something that reminds us these weren't just warriors. They were young men far from home, trying to stay human in inhuman circumstances. After Ortona fell, the Canadians had a few days' rest before moving north. Christmas 1942, a sergeant from the Seaforth Highlanders, a guy named McLeod, somehow acquired a turkey. No one asked where he got it. You didn't ask those questions. He roasted it over a barrel fire in the ruins of a church. 30 men from his company, sitting in the rubble of a town they'd just destroyed, passing around pieces of turkey and a bottle of wine McLeod had liberated from a German officer's quarters. They sang Christmas carols, off-key, half-remembered lyrics, Silent Night in English and French, and a little bit of Italian they'd picked up from the locals. For 2 hours they weren't soldiers. They were just young men trying to remember what peace felt like. Then the orders came. Move north. Next objective. They packed their gear, shouldered their rifles, and marched back into the war. But for those 2 hours, they'd been human again. Fast forward 9 months. September 1944. Allied armies are racing across France. The Germans are in full retreat. Paris is liberated. The end seems near. General Patton's Third Army is driving toward Germany. General Hodges' First Army is pushing toward the Rhine. Montgomery's 21st Army Group is advancing through Belgium, and then they all stop. Not because of German resistance, because they've run out of gas, literally. Every gallon of fuel, every artillery shell, every can of rations is being trucked 400 miles from the Normandy beaches. The longest supply line in military history is strangling the Allied advance. The solution is obvious: the port of Antwerp. Belgium's largest harbor, capable of handling the tonnage needed to supply 2 million Allied troops. The British liberated Antwerp on September 4th, barely damaged, perfect. Except for one problem: Antwerp sits 50 miles inland from the North Sea up the Scheldt estuary, and the Germans still control both sides of that estuary. Without clearing them, not a single supply ship can reach Antwerp. The port is useless. Allied Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower understands this immediately. He issues orders. Clear the Scheldt. This operation is essential before we can advance deep into Germany. British Field Marshal Montgomery agrees the opening of Antwerp is absolutely vital. There's just one problem: nobody wants the job. British armored divisions look at the terrain and say no. The Scheldt approaches are flat reclaimed land, polders below sea level, protected by dikes. The Germans have deliberately flooded huge areas. Tanks can't operate. American divisions are committed elsewhere. Patton wants to drive straight to Berlin. Hodges is preparing to breach the Siegfried Line. So, once again, the job goes to the Canadians. 1st Canadian Army. October 2nd, the Battle of the Scheldt begins. Imagine fighting a war in a flooded parking lot. Flat as a table for miles. No trees, no hills, no buildings to hide behind. Just open ground swept by German machine guns from concrete bunkers. And water everywhere, waist deep in some places. Canadian soldiers advanced through freezing water that turned their feet numb, made their weapons malfunction, and turned every step into exhausting labor. The Germans defending the Scheldt thought the terrain was their best ally. They believed no sane commander would order an attack through such conditions. The Canadians attacked anyway. They used Buffalo amphibious carriers when they could. Mostly they walked. Platoons wading through water up to their chests, rifles held overhead, praying the Germans didn't open fire before they reached solid ground. When they reached a German strongpoint, there was no clever tactic, just straight-ahead assault. Fix bayonets. Charge through machine gun fire. Take the bunker or die trying. Canadian artillery, inheriting World War I expertise from Vimy Ridge, provided covering fire so precise that German gunners stopped firing more than a few rounds before retreating, knowing Canadian shells would find them within minutes. By early November, the Scheldt was clear. Every German strongpoint taken. On November 28, 944, the first Allied supply ships docked at Antwerp. Within weeks, the fuel that fed Patton's advance to the Rhine was flowing through that port. The ammunition that broke the Siegfried Line came through Antwerp. Without the Scheldt, there is no spring 1945 offensive. The war lasts months longer, thousands more die. That's what the Canadians bought with their blood. The cost. 6-7 Canadian casualties out of roughly 40,000 engaged. Most American history books give the Scheldt a paragraph. Some don't mention it at all. But ask any logistics officer who studied World War II, and they'll tell you the Scheldt was as important as D-Day. You can't win a modern war without supplies. The Canadians won the battle that opened the supply line that won the war. Let me give you a number, a single number that tells you everything you need to know about what Canada did in World War II. Canadian Army casualty rate in Northwest Europe, 18% of deployed strength. American rate, or British rate, 12. Why were Canadian casualties higher? Not because they fought stupidly, not because they were reckless, because they were given the hardest jobs. When Allied command looked at a map and saw an objective that seemed impossible, too heavily defended, terrain too difficult, weather too bad, they sent Canadians, Ortona, the Scheldt, closing the Falaise Gap, breaking the Hitler Line, taking Caen. Every one of these battles was a meat grinder. Everyone went to the Canadians. This created a vicious cycle. Canadian troops were so effective at breaking through that they were always sent to the next impossible objective. They never got the easy jobs. They went from one nightmare to the next. The human cost was staggering. Canada entered the war with a population of 11 million. They suffered 45,000 dead, another 55,000 wounded, 100,000 casualties out of 730,000 who served overseas. Proportionally, that's like America losing 600,000 dead in World War II instead of the 405,000 we actually lost. And remember, these were volunteers. Canada didn't implement full conscription until very late in the war. Most of the men who died at Ortona, the Scheldt, and Normandy had enlisted voluntarily. They crossed an ocean to fight a war that wasn't directly threatening their homeland. Why? Ask the veterans, the few still alive, and they'll tell you. Because it was the right thing to do. Because freedom mattered. Because when tyranny threatens the world, you don't wait until it comes to your door. Sound familiar? That's the same reason American boys fought. The same reason British boys fought. The same reason any of the greatest generation fought. We were all in it together. We just didn't know some of our brothers were carrying more than their share of the load. So why didn't you learn this in school? Why do most Americans know about Omaha Beach and the Battle of the Bulge, but not Ortona or the Scheldt? 3 reasons. First, scale. Canada's entire army was smaller than some American army groups. When you're writing the history of a war with 16 million Americans in uniform, 730,000 Canadians become a footnote. Second, narrative. The American story of World War II is clean. We were attacked, we mobilized, we won. Canada fighting as part of the British Empire doesn't fit that narrative neatly. Third, Cold War politics. After 1940, America and Soviet Union became the superpowers. Canada was a junior partner in NATO. When Americans thought about allies, we thought about Britain, maybe France. Canada got lumped in as basically Britain. But here's what that overlooks. Canada's war lasted longer than ours. They declared war in September 19. We didn't enter until December 1941. That's 27 extra months of mobilization, training, sacrifice. Canada's war cost more proportionally. And Canada's war taught us lessons we still use. Urban warfare tactics, artillery coordination, combined arms doctrine, Canadian innovations, and Canadian blood paid for knowledge that saved American lives in every war since. You want proof? Next time you see a documentary about Navy SEALs or Army Rangers, notice how many training missions involve Canadian JTF-2 Special Forces. Notice how the longest-range sniper kill in history, 40 meters in 2000, was made by a Canadian. That military culture didn't appear from nowhere. It was forged in Ortona, the Scheldt, and 100 other battles where Canadians did the jobs nobody else wanted. Let me tell you one more story. December 1944, Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last desperate offensive in the West. American forces in the Ardennes, surrounded, outgunned, fighting for survival in the worst winter in 50 years. Every Allied reserve rushed south to help. And quietly, without fanfare, 1st Canadian Army took over the entire British 2nd Army sector in the Netherlands. They doubled their frontage. They held a line twice as long with the same number of men so British reserves could go south and help Americans. No headlines, no glory, just Allies doing what Allies do. Or this. Operation Varsity, March 1940, the airborne assault across the Rhine. Largest single-day airborne operation in history. American 82nd and 101st Airborne, British 6th Airborne, and Canadian 1st Parachute Battalion jumping alongside Americans, dying alongside Americans, liberating Germany alongside Americans. That's what real alliance looks like. Not keeping score of who contributed what. Just nations fighting together because the cause is bigger than any one flag. Here's what bothers me most about how we forgot Canada's war. We dishonor our own veterans by forgetting theirs. My father fought at Iwo Jima. He came home with shrapnel in his leg and nightmares that never went away. But he also came home with stories about the guys who fought beside him, the brothers he made in the Pacific. Those men weren't all American. Some were Australian. Some were from New Zealand. Some were from places he couldn't pronounce, but they all bled the same. They all fought for the same reason. They were all his brothers. The Canadian soldiers who mouse-holed through Ortona, they were brothers to the American Marines who would use those same tactics in Hughes City and Fallujah. The Canadian gunners who provided covering fire at the Scheldt, they were brothers to the American artillery crews who pounded German positions across France. The Canadian infantry who cleared Juno Beach, they were brothers to the American infantry who fought their way off Omaha. When we forget their story, we forget a piece of our own story. We forget that America didn't win World War II alone. We won it with allies, real allies, allies who paid in blood alongside us. I want you to imagine something with me. Imagine you're 22 years old. You grew up on a farm in Saskatchewan or a fishing village in Nova Scotia. You've never been more than 50 miles from home. Then in 1939, Hitler invades Poland. Britain declares war. Canada follows. You volunteer, not because you have to, because it's the right thing to do. You spend 3 years training in England, waiting, wondering if you'll ever see combat, wondering if you'll ever go home. Then D-Day comes. You storm Juno Beach, you fight through Normandy, you clear the Scheldt, you liberate Holland, you cross the Rhine. And finally, May 8th, 1945, the war ends. You made it. Against all odds, you survived. You go home, back to that farm in Saskatchewan, back to that fishing village in Nova Scotia, and life goes on. You work, you raise a family, you grow old, and 70 years later, you watch the History Channel and see documentaries about World War II that barely mention your country's name. You see Americans talk about how we won the war. You see British people talk about their finest hour, and you say nothing because that's not why you fought. You didn't fight for recognition. You fought because it needed to be done. But here's what I want to say to those veterans, the few still alive, and to the memory of those who've passed. We see you now. We remember you now, and we're sorry it took so long. You weren't the biggest army. You weren't the most famous. But you were there when it mattered most, doing the jobs nobody else would do. That's not a footnote. That's a legacy that deserves to be carved in granite and remembered for as long as free people tell stories about the cost of freedom. It's 26 now, 81 years since VE Day. The number of World War II veterans still alive drops every day. My father's been gone almost 40 years. Soon there will be no one left who remembers, no one who can tell you what Juno Beach smelled like, no one who can describe the sound of mouse holing in Ortona, no one who felt the cold water of the Scheldt trying to pull them under. All we'll have are the records, the archives, the histories we choose to preserve. So I'm asking you to choose to preserve this one. Remember them. Not just the American heroes, all of them. The Canadians who did the dirty work. The British who held the line. The Australians, the New Zealanders, the Free French, the Poles, all the nations that looked at Nazi tyranny and said, no, not on our watch. Remember that Canada didn't have to fight. They chose to, twice. World War I and World War II. They crossed an ocean, lost a generation, and never asked for glory. They just did the job. Remember that the tactics saving American lives today were pioneered by Canadian soldiers 80 years ago in an Italian town you've never heard of. Remember that the port which supplied the final Allied offensive was cleared by Canadian blood in a Dutch estuary most history books ignore. Remember that when Jack Simpson came home to Vancouver, he didn't want parades or medals. He just wanted to work at his lumber mill and watch his kids grow up and forget the things he'd seen in Ortona. But we shouldn't forget. We owe him and thousands like him the simple dignity of remembering their names and what they did and why it mattered. They were our brothers in arms. They fought beside us. They died beside us. They won beside us. And the least we can do is tell their story while there's still time. To the Canadian soldiers of World War II, from an American who only learned your story far too late, thank you. Thank you for the sacrifices you made. Thank you for the battles you won. Thank you for being the kind of ally every nation hopes for and few deserve. You weren't the biggest army. You weren't the most famous. But when the world needed someone to storm impossible beaches, to fight through medieval fortresses street by street, to wade through freezing water toward German machine guns, you were there, and you paid for it with blood and suffering that should never be forgotten. My father used to say something about his war. He said the worst sin isn't dying for your country. The worst sin is letting the men who died be forgotten. He was talking about his brothers from Iwo Jima, but it applies to all of them. American, Canadian, British, all the men who fought and died so we could grow old in freedom. So I'm doing what my father taught me. I'm remembering. I'm telling the story, and I'm asking you to do the same. Tell someone about Ortona. Tell someone about the Scheldt. Tell someone about the Canadians who helped win a war and never asked for credit. Tell the story while there's still time, because soon we'll be the last generation that knew any of them personally. And after us, all that remains is whether we chose to remember. Jack Simpson died in '98. His grandson found his medals in a shoebox. The kid didn't even know his grandfather had fought in the war. Jack never told him, never told anyone. That's the kind of men they were. They did impossible things and then came home and lived quiet lives and let the world forget. But we can't let that happen anymore. We can't let the Jack Simpsons and the thousands like him disappear into history as footnotes. They weren't footnotes. They were the men who changed warfare, who opened the ports, who stormed the beaches, who held the line when holding it seemed impossible. They were farmers and loggers and factory workers who became the kind of soldiers even the Germans had to respect. They were volunteers who crossed an ocean to fight for freedom when they could have stayed home in safety. They were brothers to every American who ever wore a uniform. And their story deserves to be told as long as free people remember what freedom costs. So here's my promise to you and to them. I'll keep telling this story. I'll keep reminding people that Canada was there from the beginning, that they paid more than their share, that they did the jobs that needed doing without complaint or recognition. I'll keep saying their names and describing their battles until everyone knows that when America talks about World War II and says we won, the we includes the Canadians who bled beside us. Because that's the truth, and the truth honors them more than any myth or legend ever could. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And thank you for helping me keep their memory alive. They earned that much and more, lest we forget.